No. So you. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. If you want, now you can get an email newsletter.
Good morning, everyone. All right, I'm going to let everyone settle in. Excellent. So good morning. My name is Mary Ellen Delastrito. I'm the president of the AAUW Salem branch. I'm really happy to see all of you here this morning for our Women's History Month event. We're really excited today. So I wanted to give you just a little bit of information about the AAUW Salem branch. So we are a community organization, and we have been around for many years. We just celebrated our 95th birthday in Salem. And our focus is on educational equity for women and girls. So, and we every month, or every March, look toward Women's History Month as something that we celebrate. So I'm going to introduce one of our guests, and then she's going to introduce the rest this morning. But I also want to remind, where's all of our members? I see you all out there with your name tags. Members to stick around after the end of the program because we're going to have elections. So the rest of you, if you don't want to stay for that, that's okay. Okay. All right, so I'm introducing Dr. Yvonne Fasold, and she's here on my left, and she grew up on a dairy farm in Cottage Grove, and she and her husband both graduated from Cottage Grove High School. Yvonne graduated from U of O with a BA, MA, and PhD before entering her career as an educator. She worked as many years as teaching English and as a reading specialist at Sheldon High School. And Yvonne's mother was a welder during World War II, as some of you saw already. And Yvonne was a past president of the American Rosie the Riveters Association. So I'm going to turn it over to her.
Gosh, I'm going to make it hard right away for the gentleman who's filming because I want to introduce you to my mother. You might not be able to see clear over there, but the reason I'm a member of the American Rosie the Riveters Association is my mother, right here in the middle, Alice Riddle. She was a welder at Todd Pacific Shipyards in Tacoma. And yes, we did grow up on a farm, and yes, on a farm there are all kinds of things to weld, you know, trailer hitches, trailers. So this is her shipyard badge, a blow-up, and this is Mother's 95th birthday. And the glorious thing about this poster is that it's my grandson's poster that went with his school project when he was an 8th grader. He was doing a project about a hero, and he got to interview his great-grandmother before she passed away. So he finished this in March of 2013, and she passed away in August. So is that a blessing or what? So meet my mother, Alice. So once you know these independent women, you really can't, you just can't step away from helping them share their stories. So today I have 3 real live Rosie the Riveters with me. So we have Rita and Margot and Nita. And the format today is I will tell you a little bit about the organization, the American Rosie the Riveters Association. And oh, and I need to introduce Julie. Julie's doing all the work.
No, I'm not.
So you've already discovered she's over there with the books. So that's the second mission. Our first mission of the American Rosie the Riveters Association is to honor these women. The second mission is to preserve their legacy. And so you're helping preserve that legacy today. Our books do that. Our gentleman who's doing the video is doing that. So we're preserving that legacy. And our third main goal is to inspire people, especially young people, because the young people are the ones that can change the world, right? And we know that we can do it when we pull together. So those are the missions of the American Rosie the Riveters Association. And you may not have heard of that group because, in my terms, it's very young. It's only 20 years old. A woman in Alabama who had been a riveter said, gosh, 6 million women came into the workforce and we don't have an organization to honor them. And so I think that was a lot of foresight, and it's just like a Rosie to do that. They're all very independent, very spirited women. They're all over 90 now, and I get to hang around with them. So I mentioned the books. All of these tabs in this book are women that I know personally and who have inspired me. So you can tell how I love being around the women. I get to meet women from all over the United States. There's a newsletter, and our convention is going to be in New Orleans, and talk to Julie about membership. So I started to tell you the format, and the format is that each woman will tell briefly how she became Rosie the Riveter. So I guess that's the first thing I need to explain, is that this shirt, this poster, raise your hand if you have seen this image somewhere. Right, you have seen the image, and yet many of the people who have seen the image don't associate it with the women who did the work during World War II. And so this image is an iconic image, and it's the umbrella. It's the umbrella for all the women who did all the jobs of World War II. So this shirt was a poster. It was a recruiting poster, because women weren't just naturally thinking that they should be building airplanes and ships and rifles. They weren't naturally thinking that. And so the government was recruiting women, saying, come, we need you for the country. And so they were recruiting posters, and this was the most famous recruiting poster. So each woman will tell a little bit about what she did, and then I'll ask them some questions to try to get into some of the things they've told me, but they forgot to tell you. I know all their secrets. And then there'll be opportunity for you to ask questions, because I know you'll have questions also. So it'll be my job to just move the microphone along to each of the Rosies and to field the questions. Before we start, I would like to read a poem to you. This poem was written by Donalyn Langtree in Michigan. She was a former president of the American Rosie the Riveter Association after our founder. And by the way, our founder wrote the yellow book over there. And in Lane County, we gave every school one of those books. So the founder wrote that book, and Donalyn was the next president. And she wrote this poem called They Were Rosies. They were Rosies. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, wives, and grandmothers. They were Rosies. They worked as riveters, buckers, sanders, welders, crane operators, bus drivers, uniform makers, bullet makers, parachute folders, clerical workers, shipyard workers, assembly line workers, Red Cross, and so much more. They were Rosies. They came from all over our country. They came from small towns and big cities. They came from Washington to Florida, from Michigan to Texas, from Maine to Oregon, and everywhere in between. They were Rosies. They were teenagers, young adults, senior citizens. They came together with one purpose: to help win the war. They built 80,000 landing craft, 100,000 tanks, 300,000 aircraft, 15 million guns, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. They were Rosies. They were more than women working together. They had to raise their children and worry about their loved ones overseas. After all these years, will anyone remember that they were Rosies? Yes, we will, because we were here today. Thank you for being here. All right, so we're going to start with Nita. And so, let's see. I'm just wondering if I just want to start questioning her and embarrassing her, but no, Nita, tell a little bit about how you managed to become a Rosie.
The very first thing when I became a Rosie was I lived in Eastern Oregon on a ranch, and I guess I saw it in the paper or something. I was 18, and I thought, that sounds interesting, and they pay good money. Like, what was it?
They paid union scale.
Yeah.
My mother earned union scale in the shipyard.
What she earned?
You know, if Opal were here, Opal always says that she was earning $5 a week taking care of children, and she went to work in the shipyards. Opal went in Santa Monica, and she was making $90 a week. $90 in 1943. That was 43. All right, so you're making good money. You heard they were.
I heard they were, yeah. I didn't graduate till 44, so I was one of the younger getting there to get rich. Anyway, yeah, it was I didn't tell my parents. I was living on my own because I had left home and working on my own at the time, going to high school, and I decided, well, I think I'll just go over there. So I did. My poor mom, I guess she just about had a heart attack because she didn't know where I was. But I did go to my grandmother's first in Portland so that she could tell my dad and then that I was okay. So then I was a welder first, went there, and since it was kind of, war was ending a little bit. When women are welders, they're better than men. They really are, because all our foremen told me they were. We were better. We were very good, very careful. And when they laid me off, I went to Boeing up in Seattle to learn to rivet. And they said I was a natural at that. I think I was strong because of working on the ranch and everything. Because the rivet gun weighed 45 pounds. So you had to have a little bit of muscle to do that. Then my 3 minutes are up.
Don't carry you so early. So, tell me, I've heard that there are buckers and riveters. Tell me the difference.
The bucker is, we have a chunk of wood that was held against behind, and then we riveted into that. And so I had a boy, a young kid that was, he said he was 18, but no way. 18. Anyway, they held that against the back, and you riveted in on the other side, because you had to have something really strong, because you were riveting with a rivet gun and putting that plane together. And he and I were we were kind of skinny and small then, and so they put us in the wings, and we went in through the wings, but then they had to pull us out by our feet. We could not, we didn't have room enough to wiggle, so they had to pull us out by the feet. It was funny. But
Well, let's see, I think you have one more minute, so, why don't you just tell them about your Harley Davidson?
oh, okay, I had the neatest little Harley Davidson, 45, and they rode it all over. And there was a bunch of young guys that I rode with, and we had a great time. They treated me very respectful, and we were not the Hells Angels. We were a bunch of kids, and because I was like 19 at the time, and we were a bunch of kids, and we just had a good time. And I love that. I've got a picture where my sister's 22 years younger than I, and I've got a picture. I'm sitting on there, and she's standing in front of me, because she's just this little baby. Yeah. And Mom wouldn't let me take her for a ride, though. No way, Jose. Not going to go for a ride. Not on that thing.
Well, I have some other questions for you later, Nia.
Okay.
But now I want to hear from each of the Rosies. So let's hear a totally different. Thank you. And so let's hear from a totally different perspective. So Margot.
Well, I was as young as I guess as you can be to be a Rosie, because I was only 16. When I graduated from high school, I really questioned whether I should apply for any work, because I was signed up to go to Oberlin College in the fall, but I said, well, I just won't tell them about that. And so I did. My mother had always been a minister's wife, but she got involved in being a Rosie the Riveter, and she was working for, I don't really know what she was doing, but what she was doing, she was working the rules were that if you were a man, you could work your way into what she did. But if you were a woman, you had to have had calculus. And fortunately, she had had 2 years of medical school before she married my father, so she could do it. And so she was one of the women who was working there, who knew calculus and could get the job. So when I graduated from high school, it was, I thought, well, I ought to get a job for the summer. I don't think I'll tell them I'm going to go to college in the fall, because that might keep me out of it. But so I joined up, and I was working for the Springfield Armory, and they were taking a lot of people, including me, who didn't really know all of the talents that she had, but that was okay. So the first thing that I was doing at the Springfield Armory was putting bullets together. I don't remember what I was doing. It was for the Garand rifle, and that was something that you could do without any experience and so forth, so that was what I did. So I worked on that for a while, and then there were other things that needed to be done around the place. Sometimes it's just a matter of wheeling the positions for doing one kind of work into what was going to come next for doing that. So that was fine. And so I got a job there, and it was rather interesting. They really were hard up for people, and I know that because there was one girl that was working with me, and she really wasn't all that bright, to tell you the truth. But she got a job there because they needed everybody, and so she did that. I also remember that one of the other women that I worked with occasionally she got a 42, which was a demerit of some sort, because she had the colonel that ran the place had a garden, and she had gone by the garden and she had picked some tomatoes out of the garden, and she got a demerit for that.
But wasn't that a special, that was a victory garden?
Oh yes, oh yes.
So do you want to explain what a victory garden is?
Oh goodness, yes. Well, a lot of farmers were being drafted, and so forth, and so the theory was that people who were staying at home, they could help the war effort just by growing their own garden, so that they wouldn't have to buy it, and so that the farmers wouldn't have to be doing it. So that was something that was important for them. And there were other things that people had to do. Well, let's see. I already said that this woman got. Yeah, she got in trouble for. But she still was working there. Then one of the other things that I did was, well, I just wheeled things from one place to another when people were through with one stage of the process of making Garand rifles. And then one of the other things I did was, they couldn't just send them out after they were put together. They had to be sure that they would work. And so what they did then was they sent them to the firing room, and they fired them to be sure that they were working correctly. And then after they were ready, of course, you couldn't send them out already fired. You had to send them out in really good condition. And so that was one of the jobs that I had, was going and cleaning up the Garand rifles after they'd been made.
All right. I should say that one of the, yes, just a second.
I didn't get her name, Margot?
Yes.
We're talking about that she was 16-year-old, her story, but working there. And what shipyard?
No,
It wasn't a shipyard, it was in Springfield, Massachusetts.
Oh, okay.
It was federal. And,
right, Margot Dennison, or Margaret Dennison. She worked at the Springfield Armory in Springfield, Massachusetts. So that just shows how many different jobs there were. I mean, every job you can imagine, that's what the women did. So Nita went from Umatilla County to Portland to
Malheur County.
Oh, Malheur. I was thinking it was Umatilla.
No.
Malheur County.
Umatilla's up north. Malheur is clear in eastern Oregon, as far as you can get.
What town?
Ontario.
Ontario in Malheur County.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, yes. So Nita Eggers then went to Swan Island first in Portland.
No, I went downtown in the Portland shipyards.
Oh, see?
Portland shipyards is where she was.
She was at Portland shipyards,
Yeah,
and
that
then
was
she went up to Boeing.
They laid us off, and
Right, because it was 1940, it was,
44, 45.
yeah, see, the war was winding down in 45, so that's why they were laying people off at the shipyards. But they still needed people at Boeing. So,
Thank you.
right, and then what I was saying about my mother was a welder in Tacoma, Washington. So I was going to say, in relationship to what Margot said, this book where I know the people, well, there are many of my Eugene, Springfield, Cottage Grove chapter members in here. And one of the chapter members was an ammunition inspector. She just celebrated her 100th birthday. So she worked for Remington Arms in Colorado. And she said exactly what Margot was saying, that every cartridge that went out of there was inspected 3 times. Because the women always said they wanted to do the best job that they possibly could, because the troops were counting on them. All right, so next we have Rita Hathaway, who lives here in Salem. So actually, Nita now lives in Albany, And Margot now lives in Corvallis. And Rita lives in Salem, at Salem Town, right?
Yes.
All right, we'd love to hear your story.
I'm going to stand up because I will talk better and reach the people in the back better if I stand up. Okay, my story goes way back to World War I. My dad was in the Lost Battalion in France in the Argonne Forest, World War I. One of the few survivors. I heard his stories as when I was little, growing up. World War I was to be the war that ended all wars. Well, then I went to Oregon State College before it became Oregon State University. And it was in December the 6th, 1941, I think, that Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. I thought, oh, here we go again. So we were in a war. I was dating, and my husband and I were married on 1942, September, before he was drafted. I continued in college until he got through basic training. Then I followed him to Illinois, Madison, Wisconsin, Florida. It was interesting in Wisconsin at Madison Truex Field. I worked in the post exchange, flipping hamburgers, egg sandwiches, milkshakes, or whatever for the veterans or the servicemen who would come in. It was the same PX close to where my husband was situated, so I got to see him quite often. Following him was an interesting experience. I was glad I had my marriage certificate along because they were, especially Madison, they were trying to keep camp followers out because syphilis was really taking hold. The boys couldn't even leave their where they were situated without 2 condoms in their pocket. If they thought they were subject to probably an STD, they had to get a penicillin shot before they got back into camp. Anyway, he was sent overseas in December 1943, January 1944. He was trained as a radar mechanic, served on the C-47s in England that flew, and the C-47s carried paratroopers into Normandy on D-Day, go back to England on a wing and a prayer, pick up more paratroopers to drop them into Normandy. Then, when the Allies freed Paris, he was sent to sneak through the German lines into Belgium to set up radar and sneak back out again. Yeah, Buddy went with him with a gun, and on their way back, they got back to base. Jim turned to his buddy and says, "I'm so glad we made it back through the German lines." The buddy said, "I am really glad we made it back because my orders were to shoot you rather than have you be captured by the Germans." I was kind of upset with Patton. Patton was really prioritizing winning World War II above the individual lives of the military. Okay. While he was overseas, I went back to Oregon State, was teaching and got my degree. I was teaching school in Oregon City. Then spring vacation came in March. I wondered what I was going to do for the summer. I visited my uncle who was living just south of Seattle. He was a school teacher, and he says he worked at Boeing's. That come up if they could use me. So summer of 1945, I was living with my uncle and his family, carpooling to Boeing's. I was hired as a rivet bucker on the left wing of the B-29. Sometimes the riveter and I would change places just to break the monotony. We were putting out planes as fast as we could because Roosevelt had asked for at least 50,000 planes be built a year. We hadn't built about 37,000 planes before 1940 when Roosevelt made that announcement. And that was more than what had been made since the Wright brothers' first flight. Then, by 2 years later, we had made 96,000 planes. One of them was the B-29, the first two that came off were built in 1943, so they were new. They'd been developed because, well, the B-24s were used in the Pacific bombing, and I was talking with one of the bombers who's still alive, and he says when they were shot down by the Japanese, they had only 5 minutes to get out of that plane before it sank. The B-24s were the forerunners of the B-17s. And so the B-17s were better bombers. They didn't sink quite as fast, but the Japanese found that if they could take out the lead plane, the ones behind wouldn't know where to go because they didn't have enough people trained to be navigators. Like my husband was in his radar. He's like a navigator on the ones that dropped the bombs in Normandy. Well, Dr. Doolittle, who was one of the pilots or had in the Pacific on the B-17s, found a way that they could take off and land in 500 feet, about the size of a football field. And with that knowledge, they were able to improve the B-29s so that it could make a trip carrying big tons to Japan. I'll finish it up.
Yeah.
Okay. But anyway, this war, it's left a lot of impact on me. Well, I was bucking rivets on the B-29, August the 6th, 1945, that summer. We took a 15-minute break in the morning and a 15-minute break in the afternoon, everybody at once, because we were building planes fast, and an assembly line system like the automobile industry was doing. The whistle blew for our break, then came the loudspeaker a B-29 had just dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. My husband was at that time in Marseille, France, ready to be shipped to the Pacific. And he wrote to me on V-mail, I survived the war in Europe. I will not survive flying over France, over Japan. This will be curtains. So that was in my mind. August the 6th, the bomb dropped. I thought, oh, the best birthday present I ever had. 3 days later, Nagasaki. Then the war was ended, and I went back to Oregon City to continue teaching. Jim's ship.
I have to stop you.
Okay, Jim's ship was rerouted. Instead of going to the Philippines, it turned around, came back to Virginia on our East Coast, and he was home by Thanksgiving.
So you can tell, living history right here, she knows so much. And,
Oh, I have
and
more stories.
yeah, we couldn't tell that. So thank you. Now, Rita said several things that I wanted to follow up with the other ladies also. And also, I wanted you to notice the scarf. You know, I have a rosebud hat that a Rosie made me, but I also have a bandana that I could tie that way. And you know, my mom always wore bandanas. You know, we lived on a farm. She always wore the bandanas. Did your mothers or grandmothers wear those bandanas? Yeah. Why did they wear them?
Keep their hair out of machinery.
Exactly. Keep their hair clean was one thing, and to keep their hair out of machinery was another reason. And you know, our Rosies have gone into schools, and first graders and second graders, they figure that out. You know, it's just really wonderful. So,
Not only we had to keep our hair from getting into the machinery, I couldn't even wear my wedding ring. No earrings, nothing like that. I wouldn't even have a wristwatch on.
right, for safety, it was really important. There's a picture of my mother over there with her welding hat. She has it tipped up, but you know, it came down and they wore leather gloves. Well, actually, so Nita, when you were working in the shipyards, what kind of gear did you have to have?
Oh, we had very protective, you know, it wasn't like a helmet exactly, but it came down and up, and then we had to have gloves, we had to have coveralls, and we had a apron or something to protect our stomach or front, and yeah, we were covered up pretty much.
How about safety for ammunition? Did you have to have any safety precautions?
You know, I can't remember.
It was a year or so ago.
Yes. All right. So also, Rita had mentioned how fast they were making the airplanes. And as part of the Rosie the Riveter Association, we have conventions. And one of our conventions was in Ypsilanti, Michigan. And Henry Ford in Michigan did so much. There was everything that Henry Ford was doing in terms of cars and transportation. He converted all of those factories into Jeeps and airplanes and armored vehicles. And so Michigan just recently had an honor flight that was Rosies, who worked there and went to Washington, D.C. on an honor flight. But when my husband and I were in Ypsilanti, we went to Willow Run. Maybe you've heard of Willow Run. Well, try to imagine this. So I have one picture up here that just shows a huge hangar with airplanes. And so as you were saying, they were coming on the assembly line and each person did their section. So once at Ypsilanti, at Willow Run, it was a hangar and then an airfield where they tested them. And once that first plane came off that assembly line, so I don't know how long it was inside before it came off the assembly line, but once they started coming off, can you imagine this? They put out one B-24 every 57 minutes. So you wonder about the American ability to mobilize and win a war? One every 57 minutes. I couldn't believe it. And so since I've read it in more than one place, and also the shipyards, Nita and I went to the Rosie the Riveter National Park. Do you remember anything specifically about the national park?
I remember it's very large, like, how many? A fourth of an acre?
Well, I don't know that, but it's in the Richmond area.
Richmond.
There were so many shipyards in that area.
Yeah.
The thing that was amazing to me there was how they built those ships in sections, and that was Henry Kaiser there.
Oh, Kaiser. Oh.
Yeah.
I worked for Kaiser when we were doing that. My daughter works for Kaiser in Portland nowadays. She is in the medical field.
And that's actually how Kaiser started, and also, you know, Kaiser was the first person who did child care, that was actually schooling. So that was all part of, in Richmond, we took a tour of that area. They had 24-hour child care because the women were on different shifts, 24 hours. And let's see, what shift were you working?
I worked graveyard.
What's that?
12 to 8.
12 to 8 at night, and then you went home and slept the rest of the day?
Not hardly. I don't know.
What did you do?
We went running around. Very young and very energetic, and we had a good time. And we went everywhere. We went sightseeing, we went dancing, we went to all the places we could. They'd let us in.
I've heard other Rosies say that, like,
I can sleep when I get older.
Did you hear that?
Yeah.
She can sleep when she gets older. I really haven't
That's
noticed
what we
it much.
said.
When we broke a drill while we were riveting, we had to take the broken bit over to the window, replacement window, to get a new bit, but the pieces of broken, all the metal was saved to go to the shipyards to help build the ships and the railroad cars.
Right, everything, everyone, every child, no matter how young, they were all involved in helping with the war effort. So I was just going to say, when I went to the Richmond, the Rosie the Riveter National Park, it's a national park in Richmond, and I was so amazed at what Kaiser had done. They built the ships in sections, just inland just a little bit, and then they had those huge cranes where they put the sections over, and then they had crews. They at Willow Run, they had 8,000 people, a crew, 8,000 people, and three shifts a day. But they put those ships together in sections too, and I think that's the number one thing that strikes me is how the American people mobilized and how these women, they can do it. So I'll bet that you have some questions, and I can direct them to specific people, or it could be a question for all. I think we have 10 more minutes. Yes?
My question is, I know I have read that frequently after the planes were finished, then they had to be transported, and women were pilots also. Now, are they considered part of the Rosie the Riveter? They're not part, but how does that fit in?
The Rosie the Riveter Association is all the people that were home front, non-military,
There were the weight.
They were WASPs, actually. I have a really good friend who was a WASP. And WASP is Women Air Service Pilots. And she actually just passed away at age 96. And do you know that, so they ferried the planes, they tested the planes. They, so she was based in Oklahoma, and do you know that they weren't considered part of the military. They have their own organization as the Air Service Pilots. But they didn't get military benefits because they weren't considered military. So they didn't have the veterans benefits, you know, they couldn't do the veterans mortgages or the loans. But my friend went to Washington, D.C. in 2003, and she received a congressional medal along with all those other pilots. They had to fight for their rights, and not only that, but they weren't able to be buried at Arlington, but they've changed it. We had a first pilot that was buried in Arlington 3 years ago. Yes, we have a question.
I know how Rita was saying that how fast they built the planes. How fast did they do it?
They could build a plane. Well, I guess that's a good question. Every 57 minutes, a finished plane was done. But I'm not sure, does anyone have that research known? See, that's a question I need to know. How long from start to finish? It had to be pretty fast, but it was a huge hangar, so they were working on multiple planes at a time. So that's a really good question. But I know, because my mom was a welder, the fastest they built a ship was 4.5 days. Can you believe it? So that's a good question.
I have here in 1942, there was about 47,000 planes that had been made. 2 years later, we were putting out 96,000 planes a year. By the 1945, the U.S. had built 303,000 airplanes.
Thank you. All right, let's see. One thing that I think, you said that the happiest birthday you ever had was August 6th.
It happened to be the day that Hiroshima was bombed, and I thought, oh, maybe my husband won't have to go to Japan, fly over it to C-47 and not come home.
Right, and every Rosie says the happiest day of their life is when the war was over. And so maybe, well, you know the iconic picture with the nurse and the sailor, right? There's a huge statue. Have you been to the Midway, the aircraft carrier in San Diego? Yes. There is a sculpture there now. There was one that was about this high. Now there's one where I come about to the shoe of the woman. It's a huge sculpture. And that same Seward, that same sculptor has now made the Rosie the Riveters sculpture. And it was unveiled just last year at Kansas City at our convention. So it's a Rosie the River, it's a traveling sculpture. So it's, she's taller than I am, and she's looking pretty strong. I wanted to ask about that Rita talked about the happiest day. So do you remember what it was like when the war was over?
Oh, yeah. Everybody was happy. Hats flew, everybody. It was just a big celebration everywhere. And it showed on the news, you know, all the cities. They went around all the cities, and people were just jumping up and down and just, yay!
Do you remember in Massachusetts?
Yes, we went into, my mother and I went into Springfield just to see what was going on, and it was wonderful. Everybody was kissing everybody, and whether they knew them or not, it was great.
My sister and I were junior and senior in high school, and we lived in Sheridan, and we wanted to go to Portland too to celebrate, but my dad said,
No way.
Your dad was probably smart.
I had a question.
Yes.
Did you have difficulty adjusting after the war, going back to either your prior lives or to less status, less equal with men?
Okay, so what
I
did you,
didn't, I don't know.
well, Rita already told us that she went back to teaching, right? You went back to teaching.
So my husband, yeah, I was back in the classroom when my husband reached the East Coast and then was shipped for Fort Lewis.
So she had a job to return to. Do you happen to remember if your teaching salary was higher or lower?
Well, I got about $1,000 a year, and then I was under the NYA program, as so the FFA and the home economics, agriculture programs.
So that was
So
$1,000 as a teacher?
$2,000 a year for my salary.
So as a teacher, you were getting went from 1,000 to 2,000 a year as a teacher.
Yeah.
Do you know how that compares to work?
Well, beginning teachers now get over $25,000, maybe $3,000, $30,000.
No, I meant, how does that compare? Do you know how that salary compared to your Boeing salary?
Well, I worked there for the summer, and I don't know. I don't remember.
Right, there are these, you know.
I know I was trying to save all the money I could.
Right, my parents made enough money that they, of course, you know, that generation knew how to save money, didn't they? And they saved everything, and they bought a 40-acre farm up in Washington, and then they saved money and bought a farm down in Cottage Grove. So that really, really helped to have my mother's income from the shipyards. But let's see. I got sidetracked. I was asking a question. Help me out. How did you adjust? Thank you. How did you adjust? Okay, so you didn't have any trouble adjusting.
No,
And
back to teaching.
teaching. How about you?
Well, as I said, I was already scheduled to go to Oberlin College in the fall, and so I went, and that was enough to keep me busy.
Right. And Nita, you were saying you didn't have trouble adjusting.
Nope, I headed for California.
Do you see why I hang around with these women? Opal has said when she was working in Santa Monica in the shipyards that one of the adjustments that was hard for the men was to have these, what Opal calls teeny boppers, coming in and working because they were young women. But the men got used to it and realized that the women could do just as well. Most of the Rosies, you know, I've met lots of Rosies, and most of the Rosies say that they were so ecstatically happy that their loved ones were home, that they were happy then to resume the lives that had been disrupted. But there is one woman, if you have one of these, how they did it, by the way, this picture right here, right there, that's my mom and her sister. But if I know some of you have the book, so yeah, my mom's name is Riddle, like a question, so you can look her up in here. But there, in this book, there's a lady, and I helped her write her story for this book, and her name's Eleanor Otto. You maybe have seen her on television. And Eleanor, she was working for Douglas Aircraft down in Santa Monica, and she got laid off, and then she went to work in an office, and she said she couldn't stand sitting in an office, and so she got a job as a car hop, and that worked fine, except for then they wanted him to wear roller skates, and she wasn't going to be a car hop on roller skates. You didn't want to get food all over people. And so she went back to Douglas Aircraft, and she got a job. Now, it changed hands. That company changed hands. But it was an aircraft factory until 2014. And Eleanor Otto worked there that whole time.
Oh.
And she trained other people. So she was 94. She was 94 when it was Boeing, when it finally closed down in 2014. So she got laid off. And so her story is, I didn't quit, I got laid off. And I went down and I applied for unemployment. Yes. Question.
Could you talk about rosebuds?
Yes. The rosebuds are the next generation down. So any descendant of a Rosie is a rosebud. But if you're a male, then you're a rivet.
Are there any rosebuds here?
I'm a rosebud, and Julie is a rosebud. Oh, I see what you're asking. Yeah, raise your hand if you're a rosebud. Woohoo! Yeah. Now, if you want to be involved, you be sure and talk to Julie and to me, because it's up to us. You know, the Rosies are saying it's up to you guys. We want to be sure that the younger generations can be inspired. And so we can all join it, all of us can join the American Rosie the Riveter Association. We can join as a rosebud, as a rivet, as a 20th century Rosie who has a modern day job. Like we have.
May I say something?
Yes, but and you could also join as a friend or a friend of supporting.
They still need Rosie the Riveters out at McNary Airfield here in Salem, because they are repairing a B-17 that flew in World War II. It had been the roof of a service station in Milwaukee. They took it apart 3 places and 3 things, brought it down I-5 to Salem, and they're repairing it, and they need riveters. And it takes small women to work in the cockpit because they don't have much room.
That's right, thank you. Yes, and that reminds me too, the Rosies have many invitations to come to schools and other community organizations, and when we go to the schools, the Rosies like to tell the girls, you can do it. You can be a welder, you can be a riveter. The people in Eugene and Springfield in our chapter, they've gone to the high school where they do a jobs fair for unconventional jobs. It's still not really accepted practice that you're just going to think if you're a woman you can be a welder or a riveter, or we had people that worked on wiring and radios, and maybe you've read that book Atomic Girls about Oak Ridge, Tennessee. So coming into the schools is just really important. And there was a question back here. Someone? Yes.
I was just wondering how transportation worked for the 3 of you going to and from work. Because I know that there were a lot of areas where we know that rubber was rationed for tires, and we know gasoline was rationed. And so I'm wondering what the transportation was like in your 3 different areas of our country.
Transportation and housing are both were challenges. Housing
at when we were at Boeing, they had a huge building, and we had rooms there.
And then did Boeing send a bus for you?
No, I think we walked.
Okay.
It was that close.
Okay, so they could walk. Some of the places I've heard the women talking about the buses. Some of the women I've heard talk about saving their ration stamps, their gas ration stamps, and then carpooling. So let's see,
That's what we did is, I didn't have a car, but my uncle did, and we carpooled from where we were about 10 miles south of Seattle into Boeing's in Seattle to the plant. But we say gas was a premium. We just didn't have it. And public transportation, people could ride buses. The trains were reserved for the military. And so we couldn't ride on airplanes. It was interesting, we were in Florida and my husband was given a 2-week furlough to go from Florida to Oregon to visit his family before they sent him overseas. It took 5 days transportation on a military train to come to Portland and then back, and he had 14 days, so he had 4 days in Oregon, and I wanted to be able to stay in Oregon, but I couldn't ride the train. That's for military only. He got special permission from his commanding officer. He made special arrangements for me to ride on that military plane. I mean on that military train. So I was the only lady on there for the 5 days in the coach coming back to Oregon. I was going to stay here. There were no restaurants, no food on the train. The Red Cross and local people were making sandwiches for the military. So they could get off at the stations when the train stopped. And once in a while, my husband would beg for an extra sandwich or a donut so he could take it on the train to give to his wife.
And some of those, I've met some of those women from Nebraska who regularly met the trains. That's what they did. They met the trains and fed the troops. We have another question here, and then I think probably our time is probably over.
There's someone on the poster board, and there's a lot of people on the poster board over there. Who's the main character of the poster board?
Oh, the one of my mother. Her pictures are the big pictures in the middle. And so what my grandson did is he tried to find some other pictures of her family. And also there's a picture there of some Rosies, some current Rosies.
Yvonne.
She took a picture of that picture.
She's had her hand up. So
Yes.
My mother worked in the shipyard, but the Portland one, but I don't know the name because I've forgotten and I didn't write it down. But I'm taking an interest and I like to know the name. And one thing that I want to tell you, she welded, and she said that they were Indians, American Indian women that were doing jobs over there. There were Oriental women doing things there. You guys, but please, let me and remind other people that there were other women. I went to one opening that they had at the Portland Art Museum. I sing in Spanish, and I was there singing, and they had things like that all over. And they were talking about this, thing. So before I go, there's a few that raised their hand that said that they were rosebuds. Can they stand in one corner so we can take a picture? You got a camera? Because we don't know how long we're going to live, even the rosebud.
That's right. So
I'm getting older too.
So I will close, and then we can get a picture of the rosebud.
Yeah, so you'll have a record for your organization.
And one thing that is that's really important that Estella said is that was this question of integration. The shipyards and the plants, all the plants, they were integrated. And that was a really big point that they made at the Rosie the Riveter National Park, is that our society was very segregated at that time. But when women or men, if anyone wanted a job, they would come and they could be hired. And that really helped with our integration in this country.
Rita mentioned the B-17 that's being restored out at the Salem Airport, and you're a motivated group with your interest in World War II history. So you can go out there and see it on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, the hours between 10 and 2 in the afternoon. There's no charge, but they'd sure like a donation.
So that's the Salem Airport. All right, thank you. Thank you. All right, so to close, I just wanted to, first of all, thank you for being here. And the Rosies always support veterans. They always support the country. So how many veterans do we have here today? Could we have a round of applause?
Never comes up as anybody else an orphan of someone who served abroad, because we're not veterans, but we didn't have fathers that came back.
So Gold Star families. Yeah. So how many of you, first of all, how many of you had loved ones, like my 4 uncles, for example, how many of you had loved ones who served during World War II? We thank you and thank them. And then how many lost loved ones overseas? How many? So we've experienced loss in our families for our country. So so the Rosies support the troops. The Rosies did the very best they could so that it would ensure that those troops came home. And everyone in the United States pulled together at that time. So thank you for being here, and thank you, Rosie.
Don't forget, we want a photo of the rosebuds, so they have a record.
Rosebuds. Can we have all the rosebuds over here for a photo? Rosebuds.
Was president of California.
All the rosebuds.
That was always it's interesting to see someone really she remembers thank you for making me come. Otherwise well, I did want to, and I was going to cover that. What do you mean? But I did, I really she had a really hard time. It would be interesting for you to talk to her. She probably has such a different twist on it. And she's got a heart. After about 5 years, it calmed down a little bit.